Welcome to episode 2 of Unshadowed Thought with James Hall. Tonight I'm going to discuss the story of how I got injured by transcranial magnetic stimulation and the circumstances around those events. So with that being said, let's get started. It was the summer of 2018, and at the time I had been working on a single career for about 15 years, and I had encountered some work stress from a reorg that had happened, so leadership was changing, and there was pressure on to perform. There was changes in the work environment, changes to the way work was distributed and organized. None of this really was a positive thing for me. So for that reason, I had been working for a long time under a lot of pressure. So I had some depression, of which I was a runner at the time, so I was trying to eat well, run some more, do a few things to handle that. But I ended up going into my general practitioner's office, and I filled out the PHQ-9. He saw I was mildly depressed, and he discussed this new treatment with me called Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation. When he described it to me, he described it as a new kind of medical device treatment that would stimulate underactive areas of your brain that were associated with depression. And it's a really simple procedure. It's painless. You just sit in a chair. This device passes magnetic waves through your head and essentially activates neurons that aren't firing, that are like depressed activity, low activity in your brain. And then as a result of that, you feel better. You don't feel depressed. You have more energy. All these symptoms we associate with depression are essentially cured. And when he explained it that way to me, it seemed kind of amazing. It made sense to me. I know it made sense to him. And I decided to look at it and see if it was the real deal, if it was something that might legitimately help me. I had been dealing with depression for quite a while, on and off, but I'd always found a way to manage it myself. I had taken psychiatric medications on 3 or 4 different occasions. And each of those occasions lasted anywhere from like 3 to 6 months. They never ended well for me. So I never had the ability to get help from psychiatry. I always had to rely on myself. The psychiatric medications that I took, they always made me feel like a zombie. They made me drowsy. They essentially made it impossible for me to process any emotions. So while that may have reduced my depression or anxiety that I was dealing with at the time, it also made me feel inhuman, made me feel really unpleasant to the people that were around me. I wasn't myself. I was a different person. And that bothered me a lot, that people had to experience what was almost a stranger when I was on those drugs. But they never really let slip to me that they didn't like it or it was unpleasant or anything. But I knew that it was. So I think we're all looking for, a magical way to not have to experience the unpleasant things in life. And that's when I went to psychiatry, I knew it was probably a bad idea, but that's what I was looking for. I thought maybe psychiatry really had this magical answer to some of my problems, but that never turned out to be true for me. So here I was back at the doctor's office, and he was offering me a different psychiatric treatment to magically solve my problems. He had also told me that it was possible I would never experience depression again after I got transcranial magnetic stimulation, and that it could, I don't know if he mentioned it could improve cognition, but there are certainly other doctors, psychiatrists, and clinicians out there that do claim it improves cognition. And although I haven't found any basis for that, I know it's out there. So he essentially kind of sells me on this treatment, or gets me to start thinking about this treatment. By the time I was done talking to him, I was actually a little bit excited that maybe this would be something that would change my life for the better. So I went home, I did some research for a few days, and then I couldn't find anything negative online. I couldn't find any negative experiences posted from people that had had transcranial magnetic stimulation, and I felt like it was pretty safe. I discussed it with my wife, and ironically, she thought it was a bad idea. She thought it seemed too good to be true. She had a bad feeling about it. But at that point, I was so sold on it, I actually kind of pushed her to let go a little bit and just trust me, and that we should try this. And really what was driving that sentiment was that I didn't think any harm could come from transcranial magnetic stimulation. I thought that at the minimum it wouldn't work, but in the worst case scenario, I would just walk away with a clean slate with no harm done. And that didn't turn out to be true at all. Those feelings my wife had were absolutely right on the money. There should have been a lot more scrutiny cast on the situation, but I didn't do that. Instead, I convinced her to let me go to a clinic I found in town that was, as far as I know, is relatively new, but it was there and it was open. I called them. I scheduled an appointment. They were glad to have me down. They were very encouraging on the phone. And I've always been pretty diligent, especially about psychiatric treatments and trying to get to the truth. So one way I leverage the truth is by asking a lot of questions different ways, by trying to gain people's trust and sympathy for my situation. So the women that worked at the clinic that I went to, they were really kind. So told them all about my situation. And this is over the phone. Let them know what was going on. Told them I was looking into transcranial magnetic stimulation. I was like, hey, is there any chance this could cause harm? Is there anything I need to know about up front? Is there anything I should be worried about? I'd like to consider those things before I come down there. Or if you have any resources I could look at, I'd like to take a look before I come down there. They were like, no, it's fine. It's not dangerous. It's non-invasive. Really, there's no risk with it. So if you want to come down, have an appointment, we can talk to you more in person. We can get you set up. And if you like it, you can come back and do treatment. We'll work through your insurance and make sure you get approved and kind of square away all this stuff for you. And they were really personable. They were really kind. It really made me feel at ease. And so that's exactly what I did. I went down there. Well, I scheduled an appointment. I think I only needed to wait a couple days to go down there, but I scheduled an appointment and headed on down. When I got down to the clinic, the same experience that I had on the phone kind of physically manifested. The women there were fantastic. They're really kind. Again, they answered all my questions. And for me, on the phone is one thing, in person is another. I looked these women in the face and I asked them, is there any dangers that I need to worry about? Have you ever seen anybody come through your clinic that ended up getting hurt by the treatment? Does it work? Does it really work the way you guys are advertising it? I started asking them the questions face to face that maybe would be easy to answer on the phone, but maybe not as easy to be deceptive with someone if you were looking straight into their face and they were asking you honestly. Surprisingly enough, I got the same answers. They told me straight to my face, in depth and in detail, that no one had ever been hurt there. They'd never heard of anyone being hurt, and that most people benefit from it. A lot of people significantly benefited from it. They thought, 80% of the people that go through there have a solid benefit. They said the worst thing that ever happened was a few people that they had turned around and walked away or left because they weren't benefiting and they didn't want to do the treatment anymore, or they had finished treatment and just didn't report a benefit. So with that, they said, if I remember right, I think it was in that same visit, they said I could have a mapping session if I wanted to go ahead with the treatment, because they didn't have it booked, and they would essentially test with what's called a motor threshold. So they put you in the machine, they turn it on, they activate the machine, however you want to call it, and it starts working. And what they do is they line the machine up to the right spot in your head so that your finger doesn't jump, but they can apply the most energy to you through the machine that they can without getting, they look at your hand, they position your hand so that they can see it, and then if your hand spasms, twitches, or jumps, then they adjust the machine so your hand isn't twitching. And so let's back up here. And I'll do this throughout my story just to clarify things as I tell the story so that people know for themselves when something dangerous is happening or something's not right. So they're testing my motor threshold. Essentially, they're using a giant electromagnet that's hooked up to the side of my head that's just hovering millimeters off the side of my head. And they're running so much electromagnetic energy through my head that it's eliciting a kinetic response from my body. So it's firing the nerve center in my brain all the way down to my hand and giving a physiological response. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to do that. And They do this with ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, as well, but it's in a little bit of a different form. With ECT, they test the seizure threshold. And when they do that, it's kind of an initial visit with the patient where they direct electrical current through their patient to see the minimum amount they can use to elicit a seizure and do the ECT procedure. Now, in lots of cases in ECT, they don't even do that. For instance, a friend of mine, they just turned the machine to max and run her ECT treatments. That's a common practice, but according to some manufacturer guides and some practices, they are supposed to test a seizure threshold first before they do it. So this was like that. So with TMS, they're doing the opposite, but if you ask them, they say TMS is nothing like ECT. They're different, right? And what I'm going to submit to you is that's, while they are different, there's two different applications. It's inherently largely the same procedure. And in this motor threshold test, they're trying to see if they can run the most amount of energy through you without eliciting a seizure from you. And that's why they're seeing if your finger twitches or not. They're trying to see if the machine is calibrated and lined up as in such a way where it's likely to cause a seizure in the future when you're in your regular treatments. And as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this, I've done a tremendous amount of research, but there's no other reason they do that motor threshold test. There's no way for them to see, hey, your depression is improving or your anxiety is improving based on where we have this coil positioned, right? So they're not testing for efficacy. They're testing to make sure they don't have any massive snafus during TMS, because they know very well that TMS can easily elicit a seizure and major harm to the human brain and nervous system. But of course, they're not disclosing that to you, right? It's not on informed consent. It's not in the literature on the manufacturer website. It's not in scientific research. Somehow, everyone involved with TMS seemed glad to omit the fact that if you run that much electromagnetic energy through someone's brain, you can melt their brain. And by melt, I mean a thermal transfer. You can transfer a tremendous amount of heat and energy into someone's brain and make them seize and all kinds of other unpleasantness with that technology. And all they've done is really try to put a cap on that and direct the energy in such a way where we won't see those kinds of side effects. But of course, no one's really talking about that, right? No one's talking about the physics behind TMS and what we're really doing to the human brain. They just want the public to be comfortable and think, oh, we're just, what they'll tell you is that they're running magnetic waves through your head to affect your mental health, right? And that's a lie by omission. They're not running a magnetic field through your head. They're running an electromagnetic field through your head, which means there is an electric field that's intertwined with that magnetic field and they can't be pulled apart, right? In order to generate that magnetic field of that size, you have to have the corresponding electrical field in there. And while the magnetic field is also strong enough to do harm, the electrical field is what causes like the real overt harm that we see in these situations. So they're testing my motor threshold at this point, and that's kind of the baseline of the physics of what's happening. But I'm gonna have another cast where I'm gonna go really deeply into the physics and the science behind the harm of TMS, so that people can just pull that up and take a look at it and understand it without having to listen to all the depth of my story. So they do this motor threshold test. My finger twitches a little bit, which they adjust the machine, they correct it so there's no twitching, and that's it. It only takes a few moments. When you're sitting in the chair, there's this loud snapping that occurs, and then there's an unpleasantness. Some people describe it as a woodpecker, like clacking on the side of your head. For me, that's what it felt like. It was unpleasant, but it wasn't, I wouldn't associate it with pain. I'd say it's more of a sensation. It was an unpleasant sensation, an unpleasant tapping on the side of my head. And that was every time they turned on the electromagnet. They would blast rapidly alternating electrical fields through your head, and that's what that snapping sound is. So they did that. They got that squared away. I was thinking, okay, if this is all I have to deal with in order to not have to deal with depression for the rest of my life, or even have a chance at that, like, it's well worth it. I really didn't experience anything negative. Was it unpleasant? Yeah, it was unpleasant, but when you're looking at like a really supreme benefit that they were advertising, it's well worth the trade to go through that treatment. And so if I was going to come back and finish, which is kind of what I signed up for at that point. They did the little trial, they did the motor threshold test. I had to sit down and have an entrance interview with a psychiatrist, and then I could come back and do 20-minute sessions for I think 36 to 40 days. So essentially it was like 2.5 months of coming in every day of the week for that period. And then supposedly you would be done. You should have the full results of TMS. A little fuzzy on the details. I don't remember if I stuck around at that particular time, or actually, if I remember right, again, it's fuzzy. I think I came back the next day or a day later, and then I had my entrance interview, and they said if everything's good with the entrance interview, you can get treatment that same day. I think that's what it was. So I came back, I did the entrance interview. Again, it was similar to a PHQ-9. It was a little bit more in depth, and it was with the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist asked me questions that he asked about my psychiatric history, asked me about my medical history. He went through all this stuff, and he told me that I wasn't a perfect candidate for it, but I was a good candidate for it. And the staff had me filled out the PHQ-9. And at the time, I wanted everything to go well. I wanted to get the treatment and just get through it and experience the benefits. So that's what I was focused on. That was very foolish because I took the PHQ-9 or a similar type test, and they came back. I handed it in, and they came back and said, these scores are a little low. Is this really how you're feeling? Because if the scores were higher, it would be easier to get it through your insurance. And I said, yeah, you know what? I took the cue. I took the social cue there, and I knew they needed a little bit more from me. So I took it back. I crossed out my answers or erased them or took a new form or whatever it was. And then I kicked my answers up a notch to like the most extreme I could kind of validate, or the most extreme I could justify for myself and still be somewhat reasonable. So I'd like to take a step back there and look at that. This was a big red flag that I missed at the time. And essentially it's insurance fraud, right? Like, we just stepped outside the bounds of pseudoscience. I mean, the PHQ-9 is a subjective test of what your emotions are running at. And even with that subjective test, now we're fudging the paperwork. And any clinic that fudges the paperwork in any way is unethical. And that's a red flag, and it's a sign that there's a problem. If you go to any medical institution and they're asking you to fudge paperwork or redo paperwork because it's not good enough, it's no good. Like, you need to turn around and leave, or you need to really seriously consider what you're doing and the risks involved. Because while I understand how that can seem small from a patient perspective, the staff knows and the doctors know that that's an ethics violation, and it's very serious, and also that it's fraud. If this was like in a Medicare setting with an older person, right, and this happened, and then Medicare got a hold of it, the federal government that's paying for healthcare got a hold of it, the doctors and the clinicians involved are going to prison. It's a no joke thing, and there's a reason for that. It's because someone else is picking up the bill for this treatment, and everything needs to be accurate and squared away. So I totally missed the red flag. Again, I worked in the corporate world at that time. They're always pushing fake it to make it, do whatever to make it work, just get it done. And so that mentality had been ingrained in me at the time, and I just rolled with it. I picked up on the cues, and I exaggerated the form, how they asked, and then everything went fine. So the doctor reviewed the forms, he reviewed my interview, and said that I could do TMS. He didn't promise me like I was the most stellar patient in terms of my suitability for it, but he said it should help, everything should be good, and to go ahead with the treatment. So I went home that night, discussed it with my wife, and we both agreed that it'd be okay that I do treatment. Again, she was still pushing against it. She was still averse to it, but she allowed me to make my own call and make my own decisions, which is funny because anyone listening to this might be like, of course you're going to make your own decisions, but if I was a loved one in that situation and I had a strong gut feeling that there was going to be a problem or that things weren't right, in the past, I probably would have done something like, you know what, it's on your shoulders or whatever. But now at this point in my life, knowing the danger and the harm that can come from that, you better believe I'd be kicking and screaming and be like, you better get your shit right before you go in there, because anything and everything could happen to you. And if they're promising you something that looks too good to be true, you better be absolutely sure before you commit to it that that's what it is. So there's a lot of ways you can do that, right? You can get other patients' testimony. You can do, in-depth research online, looking at other people's experiences. You can look at the clinical trials. You can look at other studies and really scrutinize them and see if the results they're getting are right. You can see how small the studies are. If they're small studies, likely it's bad medicine. Anyways, I think I'll have another cast on how to scrutinize treatments properly or the best of your ability. So things weren't great at that moment, but I was still excited to go. I had a lot of positive momentum towards the treatment, so I convinced my wife to let me go. I went, and I showed up there the next day. When I showed up, everything was great. Again, the staff there, super positive and kind. I started asking them personal questions, get to know them a little bit. Again, building trust with them and making sure they were really, really being honest with me about this treatment. And that was always at the front of my mind, to be honest. While I was positive about it and really thought it was going to work, I was still questioning. Whenever I went in there, I was questioning them and asking them, hey, are you sure, this treatment's safe? It seems like a really good deal. Like there's really no injuries. There's really no side effects in the stuff. And they would always give me the affirmative. They'd always tell me absolutely. So that's what happened. So the first day, the same thing, asked them the same questions. They assured me it was okay. Sat down in the machine. They rigged me up just like for the motor threshold test, except for this time was just a regular treatment. They position the machine on your head in supposedly the exact same position every time so they can hit that sweet spot or whatever you want to call it to where they think efficacy and therapeutic results are going to be the highest. And so she got me all set up. They asked you questions like, hey, how'd you sleep last night? How are you feeling? So you kind of do a mini PHQ-9 as they're setting the machine up on you and you're in treatment. You can talk during treatment. So they hooked me up the machine. They got it all set up. They lock your head. It's not like a vice or something, but they have these little light straps on your head to help you keep it in place right where it's supposed to be. And then they say, let's start. You start. The machine starts clacking away, making that clacking noise. You feel this little unpleasant kind of pat on the side of your head, which is also really interesting, right? Because the machine's not touching you, and yet you can feel it touching you on the side of your head. You can feel your head getting hit from the side. Now, again, to zoom out, what I've found is that the results of TMS and the harm that TMS causes is, if not very, very close to post-concussive syndrome. Another person I was close to that was harmed by TMS told me that his doctor said, a different doctor that reviewed what happened to him after TMS, reviewed his injury, said that TMS is just like a jackhammer on the side of your head cracking away at it. And I have to say there's a lot of evidence for that claim and that opinion. So I'm sitting in the chair. Feels like there's tapping on the side of my head. It's going. Everything's fine. She's asking me the PHQ-9 questions. When we're done with that, I'm socializing with her, personalizing with her. She's really kind. I'm really kind. Everything goes great. And then so after 20 minutes, I'm done. I take off. I drove home okay. I felt funny. There's also some anxiety around this stuff. So I probably had a little bit of depersonalization just from the stress of being there and going through that. It was all unnatural. It was all a little bit unpleasant, but I was doing my best to have a good attitude. Felt a little funny, but not enough to really raise suspicions about anything. So I go home. I actually went back to work at that time. I was working, so I would actually do this on my lunch break, and I was lucky my job was flexible enough to where I could take off at lunch for an hour to go do my treatment and then make it back home in time. So that's what I did. Went back and worked. Everything seemed relatively fine. I slept that night. I think my sleep was fine. I remember feeling a little different in terms of my sleep. I can't really remember very well or put my finger on it. But I went back the next day. So it's a 5-day-a-week thing. You go and you do it every day. Try not to miss treatments. So I did. I went back. But this time I sit down in the chair and they're like, okay, we have to turn the machine up. And I'm like, you got to do what? Because my whole mindset at that point was centered around enduring this light tapping on my head that I had already experienced 5 days a week, 20 minutes a day for like 2.5 months. So I was prepared to do that. Now, I think this is called like the bait and switch in sales, right? Like They promise you something, and then you come in to get it. You're like, oh yeah, I'll pay for that. I'll come down, I'll get it. Say you're buying a car, right? You're like, yeah, I'll pay $5,000 for this car. You go down to the dealership, and then they're like, hey, we got your car. It's all ready for you. That's $6,000. And you're like, oh, we talked. It was 5 on the phone. How come it's 6 now? And they're like, oh, well, this and that. We did some work to whatever. It's 6,000. And then lots of times you're already committed. You already want to do it. You already love the car, right? So you're like, fine, $6,000, whatever. We'll do it, right? So with TMS, not a word about changing treatment, turning up treatment, variabilities in treatment, nothing. And here I am on the second day. This oh shit moment. They're like, yeah, we got to turn it up. And then instantly I'm like, well, what the hell does that feel like? I already got this weird unpleasant clacking on the side of my head. You can imagine what was going through my head at the time, like turning that up. So what? It's going to feel like now I'm getting hit with a hammer. Like it's going to feel piercing. I'm going to have some more sharper pain. What could that be? And they're like, people, it doesn't bother anybody. We just have to, turn it up. They made this arbitrary and really like subjective description of what was going to happen. But inherently, that if something's different and they didn't tell you up front, and this is a medical treatment, like it's probably going to be unpleasant. And so like you want to go up 5% or 10%. And I'm just like, what? How are you going to ask me that? I have no idea what going up even means. And you're going to ask me if I want to go up 5% or 10%? Like, I got a little, freaked out at that point. I kept asking them questions like, well, what does it do? What does it ever, how am I going to feel? How do I know what I want to do? And they're like, well, some people feel a little bit funny when we turn it up, so maybe it's best to start low. And, again, these really subjective terms, they're trying to describe to me, what someone else feels going through treatment when they turn up the machine when they have no point of reference for that. I mean, both these girls had gone through treatment. I understand that, but understanding or describing what it feels like when your brain starts to get melted a little bit more than it did the last time, like it's a hard descriptor, right? There's really no basis for it. Like if you really, really were good with the English language, you could come up with an excellent way to articulate that, but this is not what they're trained to do. This isn't going to benefit them in any way. So here I am. So I'm like, all right, kind of backed off. I'm like, okay, let's go slow. Like turn up a little bit this time. If everything's fine, next time you can turn it up more or whatever. And actually remembering, I think this is when we had a little bit longer conversation as well. It's like, how much do you need to turn this up? Are you turning it up like every time until we're done? Or do we turn it up a little bit and adjust it and then that's it or whatever? And they're like, you're at 50% right now of the therapeutic dose. We need to get you 120% of the therapeutic dose. That's the best place to be in. First of all, that makes no sense. Why do you need to be at 120% of the therapeutic dose? Why wouldn't you want to be at 100% of the therapeutic dose? I don't have an answer to that. I don't know why. It just sounded ridiculous, but I didn't even question that. I'm just doing it retrospectively here on the cast. So I'm like, okay, so you do 5 to 10% per time, and then you're doing it for like 2 weeks, and then you move from 50% up to 120. Okay, I get it. So we have to do this progressively for a few weeks to try to get it done. Okay, let's do 5%. Let's start low, and then I'll do it more. So we settled on 5%. Again, the women there are extremely nice, extremely kind about the whole thing and making me feel comfortable with it. So that certainly helped. I don't know if that was intentional or not. Like TMS clinics have really nice staff. They're gonna keep their patients more. Whereas if the staff was more honest or less pleasant, people wouldn't stick around for the treatment. It's another red flag. So we settle on the 5%. I turn the machine on, get to doing what we were doing the previous day, and the first thing I notice is that this is more unpleasant. Was it a physical pain? No, it wasn't a physical pain. It was an ethereal, almost like metaphysical, very hard to describe pain or uncomfortable experience. And at the time, how I described it was feeling drunk or like incapacitated. I felt impaired. It just doesn't feel good. It's almost impossible to put into human terms. It's like having your brain scrambled. If you could get smacked in the head with a bat, but not experience any pain. That's what it feels like. It's like the feeling of confusion. It's the feeling of, like, maybe if you put your head in a box, like, and pressurized the box really hard, it would feel like, just this pressure's pushing in on you, and there's no pain, but like you can't think clearly. You're kind of confused. You're just uncomfortable. Even now, it's really hard to explain, but how I came to understand it later is what the sensation was cognitive impairment. So your brain is being impaired. The function of your brain is not what it just was a moment ago. Now it's being impaired by these really intense, powerful electromagnetic waves that are pushing their way through your head. And that's actually inducing electrical current in your head as well. So what does that do? You have neurons that are using really small amounts of electrochemical energy in your head to pass messages and to operate, of which we know nothing about. We know 1% about it. And here you are having a machine put up to the side of your head and pushing energy through it that will change those signals. I mean, just that description right there may give you some better idea of how that would feel. Imagine if the whole way your body works vis-a-vis the brain is being pushed around and changed from this big invisible electromagnetic wave that's coming through. That's what was going on. So it's unpleasant. I'll describe some more of it in more detail in a little bit later, and that might help people that haven't experienced it get a picture of what it is. But it's kind of this horror show type thing that's almost hard to put into human words. But so I report this to them. I'm like, hey, this doesn't feel right. It's really uncomfortable. I don't like it, and they're like, it's okay. It'll pass. It'll go away. If you can just get through it for the 20 minutes, everything will be fine. And I'm like, okay, I can endure this for 20 minutes, especially if it goes away. It's not a big deal. It's not like I'm getting stabbed or getting cut open or something from a different medical procedure. In my brain, in my mind, I kept comparing those things like, hey, this isn't as bad as surgery. There's no overt kind of medical. I'm not getting an injection. I'm not getting a shot. I'm not getting one of these other unpleasant treatments. So, I can deal with this. So I kind of report to them the unpleasantness. The treatment finishes up. The 20 minutes was fine. And I just felt rattled. I felt confused. I felt not quite right. I felt like I had had a couple beers, and that was that. So I got my car. I drove home. I did work. It's almost like a brain fog. It was like I had this brain fog over me. And so, again, it's not a physical pain. It's just a mental uncomfortableness that you're experiencing. So I drove home relatively okay. Finished out my work day. Just did whatever I had to do to just get it done. I did that. Slept. Sleep was okay. Then the next day I get up and do it all over again. So they turn up the machine again. And I'm not sure if it was this time or the next time. But I think one of the times I maybe jumped. I think I did 5% more, and then it felt kind of similar. And then I think maybe on the third session, we jumped up to a 10% increase because I just wanted to see what it felt like. I just thought, I could probably handle this. Let's just jump 10. I don't think it'll be that bad. And we'll get to the therapeutic dosing quicker. And so I did that. And when we jumped to the 10, I think it was on like the third visit or so, there was a problem. So the confusion, the drunk feeling, the intoxication feeling, the cognitive impairment feeling became very intense. I even asked him, I was like, is this how I'm feeling? It's really bad. I don't feel well at all. Is this okay? Again, and they're like, it's fine. Don't worry about it. It'll go away. You'll be fine. And I'm like, well, I still feel fuzzy since the first treatment, and it's getting worse. Is this good? It has to resolve, because if it doesn't resolve, I'm in trouble. Like, this isn't good. And they're like, it'll resolve. Don't worry. Everything's fine. Another red flag. But I trusted them and I dealt with it. I stayed at the 10% for that treatment. But the difference was when I got in the car to drive myself home, I no longer felt safe. Now I felt like I was drunk driving. I felt like something was wrong. So I kind of got in the slow lane. I went home. I almost pulled over several times because I couldn't stay focused on the road. I was unaware of the cars around me. Everything was distorted, and yet I could still function. So I pushed through and I went home. I had done it a few days before, so I was just kind of like, just do it. Just stop worrying about it. Just do it. So I did it. I got home and I told my wife how I felt. And I was like, I can't drive myself to treatment anymore. If I'm going to continue the treatment, I need you to drive me. It's that intense. And she agreed to drive me. And again, we were both under the impression that this was just going to go away, that it was kind of a temporary thing. We were looking at it as a trade-off for kind of curing or dealing with my depression, and that it would be worth it. And of course, that didn't end up being true at all. And these were, so let's zoom out for a second. So anytime you experience a change in cognition. So if your cognition becomes harder, you get confused, you can't remember things, you can't function in the way that you were previous to feeling this way. These are huge, absolutely huge red flags for neurological injury. If you look at like post-concussive syndrome, having a concussion, lots of other brain injuries, these are hallmarks of severe and serious brain injury. Yeah, can it happen? Can you get whacked in the head, feel that way for a few days, and then be fine? Arguably, yes. A really good neurologist that knows about concussions would say, no, you're not fine. You may feel fine after that, but you're then predisposed to additional neurological damage after a serious concussion. And so this is what we're dealing with this time. I had no clue. The staff had no clue. And that's a big problem, right? If you're doing any kind of treatment on someone's brain or central nervous system and they're exhibiting confusion, intoxicated feelings and cognitive impairment, memory problems, you need to stop whatever you're doing immediately and reassess things. And you need to have some sort of measure of what damages have been done. Like, is this just going to wear off? Is your brain staying in this state? How serious is the damage? Because it's a big deal. For starters, I'm not a doctor, but after having looked at this stuff extensively, it's very clear, even to a layman, that these are things that should be taken very, very seriously. And for me and for everyone else out there getting TMS, it's super casual. These people have no ability to identify brain injury when they see it, and it might be a little over the top for me to assert someone's level of care, but they don't care about you. Like, if they listen to their instincts at all or paid any attention to what they're doing at their job, like these clinicians that are executing TMS, they would not be doing what they're doing. They don't care about your brain or your body if you're giving out serious signs of neurological damage, and they're just saying, no, just stick with the treatment, everything will be fine. It doesn't matter whether they've seen people be fine after that or not. It's every person's individual, and some people may present fine after they've had neurological damage. Some people may have a stroke, respiratory failure, or heart failure from neurological damage, and that's it. They're gone. Like, snap. It's over. So you can't know that for sure, and that's why it should be taken seriously, and it's not being taken seriously. And that's a massive problem. It's not huge, it's not moderate, it's massive. It's totally off the charts. So here we are. I had this experience. I kind of gave everybody context, and I keep going to treatment. My wife starts driving me to treatment. I can't function at work after the treatments. I just go into work. I was lucky. We were slow at that time. We were in between projects. So I could get away with just doing the absolute bare minimum, the things that I had always done. I had a friend's cover for me at work and kind of take on my workload. I told them, I was like, hey, I'm going through, I got some medical problems right now. I'm trying to work through them. Can you pick up some of my work? They gladly did it. I always had a really good team of peers at work, despite kind of the difficulties that we're getting from our leadership team. So it managed to cruise on through, and it cruised really unsignificantly. So it was just the same thing, the same drunk, impaired feeling I had all the time going to treatment. And, at this point, there's this spellbinding effect as well. Once you're impaired and your brain, your cognition is not what it was, now you've lost the ability to make your own decisions well. You've lost the ability to be like, hey, this is bad, I need to stop. A lot of your cognitive processes aren't there, so your decision making is not good. And lots of times loved ones, they're on autopilot and they're just like, yeah, we'll just keep doing what we're doing because they're not getting any cues from you. When you're every day, you're just like, hey, everything's the same. Let's just keep doing the treatment. They're not gonna just spontaneously be the one to change their tune. And so that's the way it was. So I think it was about in the middle of the treatment, about a month and a half in, I had an event where I went to treatment and then I went home and I went to sleep. Ate dinner or whatever. I finished my work day, ate dinner, and went to sleep. My wife had driven me back and forth just like every time since the time I realized I couldn't drive. And then so I went to sleep. I wake up in the middle of the night to the fire alarm in my house. It's just screaming. There's this screaming, ringing going on, and I jump up in bed. I grab my wife, shake her awake. I'm just like, we got to get the kids. We got to get out of the house and just figure out what's going on. The house is on fire. The alarm's going off. We got to get up. We got to go. I was in like a deep sleep. And she's just grogged out. She's not moving. And I'm just like, hey, this is serious. Get up, And she's like, what are you talking about? And I'm saying, the fire alarm's going. Can you hear the fire alarm? She's like, no, there's nothing there. Like, the fire alarm isn't going off. I said, what? I can hear it. Like, there's just screaming. I can hear the alarm just screaming right now. And I'm looking around and she's totally calm, like perfectly calm. And I'm like, okay, something's wrong. Like, someone doesn't hear an alarm and just act calm, right? So I start listening to her. And she's like, what do you hear? I'm like, there's ringing. There's this loud ringing. Like, it's super loud. And she's like, your ears have never rang before? I'm like, no. I said, maybe after a concert, I remember, like one time, a long time ago. She's all, my ears ring all the time. It's just ringing in your ears. You just got ringing in your ears. Like, that's it. Because there's no sound. There's nothing going on. And I'm in full-blown panic attack. Like, I'm sweating. My body just exploded. Like, I'm just totally freaking out. Which, retrospectively, I think there is some sort of significant event in my brain that caused a panic attack as well. And maybe that's what woke me up. And it wasn't the sound, because you can't hear your tinnitus when you're asleep. So I think I had a panic attack, and that probably woke me up in my sleep. But it was a physiological panic attack is what I'm thinking, is that something kind of snapped in my brain. There's some other friends of mine that had TMS harm that experienced similar events. And maybe that popped me up. And then the tinnitus that had been triggered while I was sleeping is what precipitated my thoughts about the alarm going off. So I'm laying in bed, like, totally panicked. And my wife's just like, just calm down, just relax. You'll go to sleep. Everything will be fine. The ringing will go away or whatever. So I laid in bed and awake for a couple hours that night, I think. Finally went back to sleep for a few hours before I woke up. Wake up, the ringing's there. Ringing's still going. My wife's like, it'll go away at some point. Just relax. It's fine. Just do what you're doing. So I'm doing what I'm doing. I can hear things. I can hear people. Everything's fine. But there's just a loud ringing in my ears the whole time. Just like, if you're at a concert or around some really huge noise, that blowback loud ringing that happens is just constant in my ears. So I do my stuff. Ringing's still there. Go to the TMS clinic that day, and I tell them about it. And they're just like, oh, okay, that's interesting. They don't tie it to TMS. They didn't even care about it. I mean, they're like, oh, that's interesting. They're talking to me about it like it's some existential thing that happened to me. It has nothing to do with TMS or neurological injury or anything like that. And we just continue on. They're like, yeah, it should resolve. You'll be fine. Just let us know if it stays there or whatever, and we'll just keep an eye on it. This really trivial, ridiculous kind of banter that someone that can't do anything about it would actually say. So we do the treatment. Everything continues on as normal. The ringing never goes away. And then, of course, much later on, I realized that where they apply TMS is just not very far from the auditory cortex in your brain. And also, there's always been this chatter about TMS not causing tinnitus. And it's even, I think it's in the manufacturer's literature. They give you earplugs, so you have earplugs every time you're sitting in the chair. But there's no need for it because the clacking isn't that loud in there. I know I talked to an auditory specialist afterwards that, diagnosed my tinnitus and hearing loss at like high frequencies, that they said any repetitive like loud noise can cause hearing damage. So I'm assuming that's what they're cautioning towards. Just a repetitive noise, repetitive clacking in your ears may be causing damage, but them denying so intensely that it causes tinnitus leads me to believe that they understand that it does cause tinnitus, or there's a possibility for it. Because there's been plenty of people that have done a full round of TMS with no earplugs that have been perfectly fine. The flip side, and my side, was that I had earplugs in, secured perfectly well every single time, and I developed tinnitus. So my theory behind it, what I'm thinking from what I've seen, heard, and researched, is that the damage is being done internally to the auditory cortex. So, I mean, again, I was evaluated by a hearing specialist. They're like, your cochlea is fine. You have no damage to your inner ear or, the physiology that we can see in your ear. It's something else, right? So if there's damage to the auditory cortex, you can get tinnitus. And you can't control the electrical current that's being generated in your brain, the electromagnetic fields, they're dispersing throughout your brain depending on the matter and, the water density in your brain. And the auditory cortex is right there. So I'm very certain that that's how people are getting tinnitus from TMS. And that's how I got tinnitus from TMS. So another red flag, another neurological harm that was being experienced during treatment that I expressed and was just passively blown off by the staff, which, I mean, I get it. They're not trained. They don't understand neurology. They don't understand anything about the human brain. So how could they identify it, right? So this is a really big problem, right? The FDA, the government, the manufacturer, the clinics, none of them are taking responsibility of having a neurologist or someone that knows what they're doing review patients and watch their treatment. So even if these people are the kindest people in the world, then they would be totally willing to pull someone from treatment if they were experiencing harm. They don't know what harm looks like. Neurological harm is very different than physiological harm and what people might expect that expression to look like. So that was that. That was about in the middle of treatment. And it was uneventful. The rest of it was uneventful, I still had the ringing in my ears. I still felt drunk every time I went in and out of there. As to why I didn't get worse, I don't know why I didn't get worse. I just didn't. Obviously I got worse when the tinnitus popped up and I had that panic attack. I was still getting damaged in every session, but I didn't have some overt feeling or condition that manifested during treatment that would tell me that I was getting a lot worse. So I continually had this conversation with the staff, like, hey, I feel drunk. I feel intoxicated. I don't feel right. My emotions are better. I'm calmer. And, maybe my depression's lifting a little bit. I had these positive feelings about TMS. I knew something was happening, so I wanted to be better. So I would report feeling better sometimes. And sometimes I did. When you're moderately depressed, you feel better some days, you feel bad other days, right? So they're like, oh, look, you're getting better. And then the next day I'd be like, yeah, I don't feel any better. And they'd be like, oh, okay. And you just go on with the treatment. So I think towards the end of treatment, I got laid off from work. So my leadership team saw my poor performance. I actually expressed to them that I was having a medical problem and they laid me off. So that happened. That's just another indicator that something was just bad. I had worked at this company for 15 years. I was a high performer, at least. I was going to say an exceptional employee. But in terms of my performance, I always did really, really well. 6 months before I got treatment, I had got an out of cycle raise, which is a merit-based raise. You have to be doing really good at your job, especially in a big corporation, to get a raise out of cycle. And that's what had happened. So I had gotten title and been rewarded. So obviously I was doing well. And then all of a sudden I got laid off. It didn't make sense. I was the only one that got laid off at that time. No one else got laid off. It wasn't like this big layoff of thousands of people or even hundreds of people. I was the only one. So you can decide for yourself on that one. I'm pretty sure my management team, they were a new management team. They saw that I was suffering and they decided to get rid of the problem. Those are my thoughts on it. So that happens. They packaged me out. I had some time while I was getting paid that I could try to find another job. So there wasn't necessarily a negative for me. I was like, you know what? Change your career. I'll be doing better mentally after this whole thing and we're good. So that was that. I finished up treatment. I was feeling positive about it despite my cognition being all screwed up again with the spellbinding. I didn't understand what was going on. It's the weirdest sensation. And I still experience it to this day. And it's really severe depersonalization and derealization. You feel ethereal. You feel like you're dreaming. In some situations, it's a good thing. In most situations, it's a very bad thing. especially if you don't want to feel that way. You feel kind of stuck in your own skin and really screwy. So that's where I was at. Still happening every day. I'm still asking them. I mean, at one point they told me, hey, in a couple weeks this will go away. And it didn't. And then I asked them again. They say, oh, well, let's just give it a couple more weeks. Maybe it'll go away. Asked them again. They're like, you know what? It'll go away by the end of treatment. I'm sure you won't feel this way anymore. By the end of treatment, you'll feel totally normal. Everything will be fine. So we're rolling up to the end of treatment, and I still feel this way. And I'm like, hey, we're at the end of the treatment, and I still feel stupid, like kind of drunk and intoxicated. You said it would resolve, and it hasn't. What's up with that? And the ladies are like, well, I don't know. I promise you, TMS cannot hurt you, so it's going to resolve within a few weeks of being done with treatment. Once you're away from the machine, it'll resolve. I go into the exit interview with a psychiatrist, and I'm like, hey, this is a problem. Like, something bad happened. Like, I still feel intoxicated. It's been 2.5 months. This is not good. What do I do? Like, what do I expect? What's going to happen? And he's like, listen, don't worry. It should go away in a couple weeks. It'll be fine. He said. Then he says this. He says, but if it doesn't, you should go see a neurologist because you may have developed a separate condition from TMS, unrelated to TMS, and you should get checked out for that. I looked at him, and I could have totally lost it, freaked out, maybe gone to jail. I decided not to. That was my you got moment, as a friend of mine would say. And I realized that I did this, that I went through with the treatments. I got. I should have walked away. I should have done something different. And now I knew something was wrong. And there I was. So I expressed my concern. I had him document it. And then I left. Now, when I left, I wasn't feeling so bad emotionally, although I was seriously concerned about this kind of drunk feeling that I had because I was still off work. I was still out of work for a while. I still had time to heal, to get better, and then to get a new job and get everything squared away. So I was still kind of positive. That's how things ended there. Weeks went on. I didn't feel any better. A month came and went. 2 months came and went. And I didn't feel any better. I think it was around maybe the 2-month mark where I was like, I need to get an appointment with a neurologist. That has to happen. And so I set up an appointment with a neurologist. Neurologists are so booked up here. I think I had to wait like 3 months or something ridiculous to get in with a neurologist. It was so bad. But it was nothing dire, right? So I was like, I'll just wait, and do it. During this time, things started to change. Things got worse for me. I started to develop. So I already had the tinnitus. I already had the cognitive impairment. But I started to develop fatigue. I started to get muscle twitches all over my body. Or I'm thinking maybe the muscle twitches were there sooner after TMS, but I didn't really notice them. Because every once in a while you get a muscle twitch or something. It's like, oh, my muscle twitched. I was working out or whatever, and it twitched. Well, they had become regular. So I was having random muscle twitches all over my body at rather regular intervals that I hadn't really noticed yet. So I noticed those. One day, I think I was sitting on my bed, and I was wearing shorts, and I was looking at my calf. It just happened to be. And this is it's probably 3 or 4 months after treatment at this point. My calf is spasming. It's just twitching away. It's just not stopping. I'm like, whoa, look at that. And then I watched it for a couple minutes, and it didn't stop spasming. Then I watched it for 5 and 10 minutes, and it didn't stop spasming. Then I looked at my other calf, and I realized that it was spasming too, and it didn't stop. So the spasms are not particularly painful. You can feel them. There's an unpleasant sensation involved with them, but they don't stop ever. So I was like, okay, I started kind of freaking out. It's like, okay, you know what? It's fine. Maybe I did something and they're just overactive or whatever. I'll come back and I'll keep looking at them and see whether they stop. So periodically, like at dinner, I looked, still spasming, both of them. I was like, you know what? Tomorrow morning, everything will be fine. Went to bed, woke up, looked at my calves, still spasming. Looked again that night, calves are still spasming. I realized that they don't ever stop. So these are called muscle fasciculations. Yeah, your muscles twitch uncontrollably and kind of indefinitely. These phenomena can be due to lower motor neuron disorders and all kinds of other unpleasantness, of which kind of has this loose association with it, but they can occur like naturally kind of on their own randomly for people, I guess, but they do resolve. Mine haven't resolved. It's been 3.5 years. They're still going. So it's something else. It's from TMS. And then, so my calves constantly twitch, but then I have random twitches all over my body as well. Tons of other TMS victims or people that have been harmed from TMS report the same thing. So we know it's a part of the symptomology involved with TMS. So I'm getting fasciculations now. I got tinnitus. I have cognitive impairment, although I don't know it's cognitive impairment yet. I just feel drunk and dopey all the time. And then I started getting panic attacks all the time as well. And I didn't understand what was going on with the panic attacks just at that time, but I knew I was getting them. When I went and did something new or I went and did something different, my brain would completely explode with this anxious kind of activity. It was extremely unpleasant. I stopped doing things because of that, and I was trying to figure out what was going on. It's really weird to have panic attacks and also start to develop like severe fatigue and sleep problems. It doesn't make a lot of sense. You think, hey, if someone's wound up, they don't get fatigued, but it's not true. You can have both. I started getting really, really fatigued. I started having severe physiological depression. Now, depression, in my mind and what I've heard from others, is, you can be sad for long periods of time and then get anhedonia and these different kind of feelings of just not having feelings or just being like really sad for extended periods of time. And that's one thing. What I experienced, like a physiological depression, which means my body and my brain were physiologically depressed. They shut off. I no longer experienced any emotion. And I don't consider, in this context, I don't consider anxiety and different sensations that I had emotions. I think this is a big eye-opener for me, but anxiety isn't necessarily emotion. Like, your brain shoots cortisol and stress hormones through your body, and it's a very unpleasant sensation. And people would say that's an anxious sensation or that's anxiety, but it's not necessarily. It's a physiological change. It's a chemical change in your body that you experience, and that's what I was experiencing with the panic attacks. And with the fatigue, I'd wake up every morning exhausted. I'd function for a few hours, and then I would take a nap for a few hours. I'd wake up for a few more hours, and then I would go back to bed. It became this really, really unpleasant cycle that slowly started to get worse and worse. And when it happens on that scale, it's really hard to notice what's happening. So that started to develop. I eventually got into the neurologist. He told me the same rap. He's all, TMS can't hurt you. He said, I believe you. I understand what you're saying, but I think it's going to resolve, within like a year. You should feel fine. I went to a TMS seminar. I've done a little bit of research on it, although I don't know it really well, but essentially I don't see any way that it could hurt you. It's not supposed to be able to hurt you. And I said, I was telling this guy, like, at this time, essentially, it's bullshit. Like, it can hurt you. It hurt me. Look at me. Like, this is not good. This is horrible. Like, I'm in really, really, really bad shape. Having panic attacks, like this extreme fatigue. I have tinnitus. Like, I feel drunk all the time. I have a huge list. I have the fasciculations. There's a huge list of symptoms. It's hard for me to even keep track of it. As to where I had none of this. I had none of this before TMS. So he's like, okay, like, I can give you a gabapentin. I can do these things. And I'm just like, no, I'm not taking medication for it. I know what gabapentin is going to do to me. I know it's going to slow me down worse. I'm already fatigued. My sleep is like really screwed up. I can't sleep for like 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden I'm sleeping all the time. Like, no. And so he's like, I don't know what you want to do. So they gave me an EEG. They did some diagnostics. I got an MRI with and without contrast. I got an EEG, and then I got a take-home 3-day EEG. And don't do that if you don't have to. I had tape strapped to my head and a machine strapped to my head for 3 days. It was really unpleasant. And I noticed when I had some of this extreme activity that I was experiencing, like panic attacks, like these instances of really unpleasant mental feelings and cognitive problems. Like, when your cognition's bad, it might be bad in one moment, but in another moment, you might not be able to remember your name. You may look at someone you see every day and be like, I know you're my wife, but what's your name? This stuff's happening, and I'm taking an EEG, and I noted the time and everything, and they went back and looked at the activity on the EEG, and they said your activity is normal. The regular EEG came back normal. MRI came back normal. MRI with contrast came back normal. And it was really, really disheartening. like for someone in my position who was running out of time to find another job and has a severe medical problem that people are saying you don't have or doesn't exist, it's really unpleasant. So I said, you have to be able to give me some sort of test on my mental aptitude, because I can't remember anything. If two people talk to me at the same time, I can't understand either one of them. There's these little things I've noticed that aren't working. Like I had this incident where I went to get ice in my cup to get some water, and I overfilled the ice in my cup, and the ice had spilled out all over the floor and the tray in the automatic ice maker in the fridge. I went to go get a paper towel to clean it up, and I got distracted. If you can believe this, my mental state was so poor, my cognition was so poor that I just set my cup down and I got distracted and I walked off and I ended up doing something else. Well, then I came back and I saw water all over the place because the ice cubes had melted. And then I said, oh my gosh, I forgot to collect this ice. So I went and got a paper towel, and I put a paper towel down on the water to soak it up for a moment. And then I was given a second to soak up, and then I got confused and I left. I went and did something else. Well, then my wife is like, dude, what are you doing over here? There's water all over the floor in the fridge, and there's one paper towel down on the middle of it. And I said, I can't believe it. Like I can't remember things, and I get distracted, and like I'm just so off that I can't even complete simple tasks without getting distracted and forgetting what I'm doing. And that little event was a perfect example of where I was sitting at that moment. So I pushed my neurologist to do some sort of cognitive test, and he did this little in-office test. I think it's kind of for geriatrics, like if you're getting really old, you like shouldn't drive or have these really big cognitive deficits. It catches those kinds of things. So I did the test, and actually I scored really well on it. And he's like, hey, look, you have no problems. It was like connect the dots, and there's like 20 dots on there that made a hat, and then it was like circling certain shapes. I mean, it was really rudimentary stuff that I didn't have a problem with when I was in a quiet environment in his doctor's office focusing on doing it. And I said, this test is just not adequate. I don't know if there's another test or not, but this isn't going to cut it. So he said, I can send you for a neuropsychological evaluation, and they'll measure, they'll do a lot more in-depth testing there. It can test you like for a full day and see if you have any cognitive deficits, And I said, okay, that's what I want. I want an in-depth test that's really going to dig into where I'm struggling, because there's some really big issues. So it took me quite a while it took me like 3 months to get that test. But when I did that test, first of all, the test was extremely difficult for me. I remember the psychologist that administered the test was a really kind woman, was really patient. But we were testing for about 15 minutes, and I told her I needed a break. I was exhausted. Like trying just to do like math for regular math, like simple math, for like 15 minutes completely exhausted me. It was so hard for me to try to focus enough to do simple mathematics for 15 minutes. And then she had me do these different, like move these squares around to make different shapes out of them. She read me a story and had me recount the story to her. She flashed words in front of my face and then had me associate those words with other words, these different things. And what I found was that like when she had me recall a story, I could only recall a few details about the story, but then she would retell me 3 or 4 times. And essentially you're supposed to remember more and more each time. Well, I couldn't do that. I heard a story and I could pull a couple details out, and that was the most. She kept retelling the story. I kept coming up with the same silly little details about it that just weren't much. I couldn't like grow my memory. So she put together this picture for me of all my cognitive deficits, and then started explaining to me, it's like, hey, you have cognitive impairment. This is what it looks like. And here are your deficits, and this is what you could do. Like if you're in a quiet, calm environment, you can do certain things. There's certain things that you can't do. Like if people try to give you like verbal instructions, like you're only going to be able to listen to it for like a minute and then recall some of it. But if it starts getting beyond that, you're not going to recall any of it. You're just not going to be able to remember. So that was a really big turning point for me in understanding what had happened. I mean, I'm looking at some of these cognitive tasks she had me do, and I'm at less than 1% of the population in terms of my score. And it's so far from being a high performer in a big corporation with a pretty cool job. I had come so far from there. This was the point where I realized what kind of problems TMS cause, what kind of harm I had come to. Like, I didn't know exactly how it had happened at that point, but I knew that there were significant harms, and this is what it looked like. So at that point, I think I had started looking online to try to find other people. I mentioned in the first episode that I ended up finding people. We put together a group and started figuring out more about the harms of TMS. But this really just sums up what I experienced in my story and how it unfolded, what my time at the clinic was like, how it felt, what it looked like, and the different things that I experienced. I'm sure there's some things even now that I'm omitting in there, but that really got the bulk of it. And I wanted to share that for people that want to hear the story, for people that have experienced the same thing, or people that want to learn about TMS harms and injury. That really is, from an experiential perspective, what happened to me. I'm also going to make a cast about what the science is behind the TMS injury and what happens, what are the physics behind TMS injury. I dipped into it just a real little bit in this podcast, but I'm going to take a deep dive into that. So anyone that wants to can understand the nuts and bolts of how TMS hurts you, what it does and what it looks like. And also what I'm hoping to do is have a podcast on how to try to heal some of these harms and what I've done to try to improve my life, the quality of life that I have since my TMS injury. Thanks for tuning in. It's really fantastic opportunity to get to do this podcast and have friends and anyone that's interested to be able to listen to this. So I hope everyone's doing good out there. Have a good night.